Well, we've joked about it a little bit over the course of this series, but people often don't last very long with their New Year's resolutions. But I don't want that to be the case for us when it comes to our spiritual habits. I don't want us to be like the every year New Year's resolution people who say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and by February they're not. I want what we've learned in this series to be something that sticks with us as we go about living for Christ. And so as we conclude talking about healthy habits for the soul to implement, I want to help us see a healthy view of how to keep going, because as Christians, we're called to be faithful. Paul said in his letter to Timothy, he said that it's required in stewards that a person be found faithful. We're called to be faithful. In other portions of scriptures, we're called to be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. And too often we wrongly think that means we have to do big and huge things for God. Like, I got to be faithful, so that I've got to attempt great things for God and expect great things for God, as the missionary Cary Schmidt, or not Cary Schmidt, William Cary, that's who it was. William Cary once said. But the truth is that each and every one of us can do little bitty things that will add up to those big things. We should certainly attempt great things for God, but the truth is the faith and the courage and the grace that's needed in our lives to accomplish those great things, those big things, is all the little things that we do leading up to them. Are we faithful in the small things? Jesus said that those who are faithful in little will be faithful in much. If we're faithful in the small things, that we will show faithfulness in the big things. And so I want us to recognize this morning that right at the beginning, we need to know that being faithful in the little things is a big thing. Being faithful in the little things is actually a big thing. And over time, they produce great things. Think about it in so many aspects of our life. That one workout that you do, when you stick with it and continually do that one workout, can turn into a beach body, right? Just over time, that workout consistently can turn a great result. That one phone call or that one text conversation repeated over and over again, invested into a relationship, can blossom into a great friendship, or can bring about an incredible relationship, maybe even an incredible marriage one day. Just so one phone call at a time, one conversation at a time. That savings of $1 a day can eventually become a down payment for something. That one class that you take, added with one more class, and then one more class, and then one more class. Trust me, I know. It took me 13 years to get my bachelor's, okay? One class at a time eventually turns into a certification or a degree of some kind as you compound them over time, and it could even become a career path. And as I observe the lives of people and I study the scriptures, it's become clear that faithfulness compounds. Faithfulness compounds. It really does, and it matters. Whether that's 50 years in marriage, or 5 years of being in ministry, or your first year of college, or the first couple months of working out, or the first 7 days of sobriety, when you start to string those days and those consistent habits together over time, they compound. It makes a huge difference. But in order to get that, you got to stick with it. You have to stick with it. And so when you evaluate your life, think about this. What will your life look like in 5 years? When you evaluate your life now, what will your life look like in 5 years, spiritually, relationally, financially, physically? What direction are you on? What habits do you have right now? We can, with pretty good accuracy. Now, there are some external factors that completely out of our are completely out of our control, and so we can't ever be completely accurate in our predictions. But for the most part, we can predict with a high degree of accuracy where we will be in 5 years. The habits that you have today will eventually shape who you become tomorrow. So the habits that you have today and that you have in your life right now are sending you on a direction to where you'll end up in 5 years if you can continue in those habits. So do you like the direction that your habits are taking you? Do you like the direction that your habits are taking you? Intentions don't determine direction. Actions do. So what are you doing? What are your actions, your habits now? What direction are they taking you? Because that is the direction that you're headed. And it's so important to recognize this. That's what I want us to learn today as we conclude our study on healthy habits for the soul, that where we end up eventually has to do with what we are implementing today. Our habits today will shape who we become tomorrow. And so as we think on that, let's read Galatians chapter number 6, and I'm going to read verses 7 through 9 this morning, where the Bible says this: "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And let us not grow weary while doing good. For in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart." I love how Paul says that. You could even translate it this way: don't be stupid. God cannot be mocked. That's a way that the word he uses there. He's like, don't even think for a moment that you can fool God. God is not mocked. There are laws and principles in place that whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. God will not be mocked. He cannot be deceived. If you sow seeds of habits that feed your sinful flesh, you will reap destruction. And if you sow seeds of habits that feed your spirit, then you will reap life, he says. And if that seems heavy, the truth is it is. This is a big thing, that you reap what you sow. You reap what you sow. Do you like the harvest that is coming because of the seeds that you are sowing now? How you live will determine who you become. So let's talk about the laws of reaping and sowing this morning. These are fixed principles. These are things just like the laws of gravity. If you were to think about the laws of gravity, they always say what goes up must come down, right? Okay, things like that. Newton's laws, things like that. These are fixed principles that we see in nature, we see it in life, and God tells us we see it in our spiritual lives as well. And so we need to understand them for our spiritual well-being. And the first one that we see, the laws of reaping and sowing, is that you reap what you sow. It says it right there in our text. You reap what you sow. So whatever seed you plant, that's the plant or the fruit that you will reap, right? If I plant an apple seed, I'm not expecting an orange tree or a grapevine, correct? Whatever you sow, whatever seed you plant, that is what you will reap. If you plant godly habits, you'll reap godly outcomes. If you sow ungodly habits, you will reap ungodly outcomes. God even told the Jews, the people of Israel, in the book of Hosea, through the prophet Hosea, he said this: "Sow for yourselves righteousness and reap in mercy." And then later he says, "You have plowed wickedness and you have reaped iniquity." What's he saying? What you sowed, you are reaping. What you sow, you will reap. So you reap what you sow. If you sow habits of lust into your life, then don't wonder why you don't have intimacy in your marriage. There isn't something wrong with your spouse. You're reaping a harvest of the seeds of lust that you had sown into your life. And if you're constantly eating sugar and fast food and drinking 12 packs of soda, don't wonder why you don't have a 6-pack abs, okay? Because you have consistently been sowing these seeds. And so it's not just some terrible thing that's happening to you. You're reaping a harvest of the seeds that you sowed. It's a result of what you planted. So if you reap what you sow and you don't like what you're reaping, then change what you're sowing. If you don't like what you're reaping, then change what you're sowing. If you don't like what you're getting back, look at what you're planting into the ground. If you don't like financially. I don't like where I am financially right now. I don't like the harvest I'm reaping. Then start to evaluate what seeds have you been sowing financially. If you don't like the harvest that you're reaping right now spiritually or relationally or even physically in all these, this is not just in spiritual habits. This is a principle that could go in all areas of our lives. If you don't like the harvest you're reaping, look to the seeds that you're sowing, and you're most likely getting exactly the result that you should be expecting, because those are the seeds that you have sown. So if you don't like what you're reaping, then change what you're sowing. So if you want to cultivate soul health in your life, you want to grow in your faith and grow in your walk with God and your love for others, you want to grow in these ways, it's going to start with your habits. Are you sowing spiritual seeds through your habits, or are you sowing sinful habits? Because the truth is, you reap what you sow. So if you don't like what you're reaping, then change what you're sowing. But the second law of reaping and sowing is not only do you reap what you sow, you reap more than you sow. You reap more than you sow. Because when you sow, what does God do? God multiplies it. In fact, in Mark, when Jesus is giving a parable of sowing seeds, he says that those seeds that fell on good ground, they are the ones who hear the word and accept it and bear fruit. And he's talking about those who receive the truth of the word of God into their hearts. But then he says this, when they do so, they bear fruit, some 30-fold, some 60, and some 100. What's he saying? That it seems like one little seed. But what happens when you plant an apple seed? You get an apple tree that has a lot of apples. And what's in all of those little apples? More seeds. And all of those seeds then get planted into more trees, which have more apples, which have more seeds, which have more planting. Do you see it? So it compounds. As you plant a seed, you're going to reap more than you sow. When you're nice to people, they're nice back. When you love people, they love you back. What you reap, you actually reap what you sow, and you reap more than you sow. This is true I've seen in my marriage. My wife is a multiplier, and she does it in a great ways, but if I'm not sowing the right seeds, it comes back to bite me, right? I sow love into my wife. She loves me in multiplication. I give her a hard time. I sow those kind of seeds. Then you better trust she's going to multiply the hard times she gives me. And I should learn, because I'm the more emotional of the two of us. And so if I give her a hard time, I need to be willing to, what do they say? Be served what you're dishing out, but I'm not. And so I haven't learned yet, but I sow those hard times, and then I reap in multiplication hard times. A lot of people are like that. So you sow and you end up reaping more than you sow. In his book, The Compound Effect, Darren Hardy basically teaches this. He says that smart, small choices plus consistency plus time equals a radical difference. And what he gives in that book is he tells a story of a caloric intake between one person, two different scenarios. And he gives this idea, and as I'm giving it, it's a little bit spiritualized and changed to a little bit. But think about one person in two different scenarios. One scenario, they're inconsistent in church. The other one, they're consistent in church. If you take the one who is inconsistent in church, they often sometimes feel guilty about it. And some people, in this particular instance that he gives, that he gets a little guilty about what's going on in his life, and so he drinks to numb it a little bit. And then he drinks a little bit more, and it starts as one drink a day. And he's not close to God because he's been allowing himself to drift from church. And so he starts looking at things that he shouldn't be looking at. And it compounds into a lot of things eventually that he's not proud of, because he doesn't have accountability in his life. He doesn't have friendship in his life. He doesn't have a walk with God in his life. And so a little bitty habit that he stopped starts to then compound into a lot of habits that he's really not proud about. Whereas another scenario of the same guy who stays consistent in church, goes to church consistently, reads his Bible to keep up with the messages that he's listening to in that church. He's in church, so he's serving people, and he doesn't slip into porn and things like that, because he now has accountability in his life, and he has a closeness to God that guards against it. And the truth is, if you look at the scenario, this is how he puts it. He says, when you look at the scenario of these two kinds of people, in the first 7 days, there is really no noticeable difference between the two people. between the two scenarios. In fact, even after the first month or the first few months, you can really barely tell the difference between these people often. But at month 27, there is a measurable difference. In fact, the one that he gives of caloric intake, he says that drink a day adds about 150 calories every single day to his diet, whereas the other one doesn't have that extra calories. And he's actually, because of a lot of things he's doing when he's not just sitting there sulking and drinking, he's actually burning off some calorie as well. And so he starts to go down the trail of, after the 27 months have taken place, that the one scenario has gained about 33.5 pounds, and the other one has lost upwards of possibly 33.5 pounds. And so between these two, there's now physically a measurable difference between them. One is about 67 pounds heavier than the other scenario. But you look at this, I've seen this take place in so many people's lives, even in the spiritual realm, where over time, it doesn't seem like, well, I'm not doing all of these terrible things. It's been a week, it's been a month since I've been doing those spiritual habits that I know I'm supposed to do. And at first, it doesn't seem noticeable, but you give it a year and a half, you give it 2 years, and I've seen time after time after time after time that someone ends up out of church, and then someone ends up in sexual sin, and then after that, they end up denying the faith, and it goes way farther eventually than a lot of people ever think they would ever get to. Why? Because their small little habits now are shaping who they will become later, and often you reap more than you sow. You end up getting in so much more destruction or so much more life than you ever thought because of the habits that you were sowing. When I first came to these verses, I don't remember how long ago, but I remember for the longest time as I read this, I thought it was an exaggeration by Paul. Like, okay, you sow some sinful habits, but destruction, complete death. Like, you sow some good seeds into the Spirit. Okay, yeah, but like everlasting life. I thought he was like giving hyperbole to really motivate people, but I've seen it time and time and time again. That is true. The small little sinful habits now eventually end up in total destruction. And the small Spirit-led habits now ultimately lead to abundant life. And so as I've observed people's lives and as I've looked into the Word of God, I recognize over and over that small, consistent habits over time bring about compounding results, either positive or negative, based on what you are sowing. And so don't think that it's not really that big of a deal when you stop little spiritual habits that we've talked about. Well, over time, the lack of sowing to the Spirit brings about a reaping that we never wanted in the first place. And it's a big difference. A sowing to the flesh will reap total destruction, and sowing to the Spirit will reap life everlasting. Why? Because you reap what you sow, and you reap more than you sow. But the last law of reaping and sowing is this: you reap after you sow. So you reap what you sow, you reap more than you sow, and you reap after you sow. Now, this law of reaping and sowing is why many people get discouraged and quit when they start new habits. This law right here is the reason that many people end up stopping and getting discouraged when they start new habits, because we don't see the impact immediately. We don't see the impact immediately. You pray every single day for 5 days straight and you don't feel that much different spiritually. You go to the gym consistently for 2 weeks, and at the end of those 2 weeks, you still can't run a mile, or you still look as fat or as scrawny as you did when you first started. And you're paying off debt, and you don't buy coffee for a whole month long, and you save $100 to put toward your debt. And now you don't owe $20,500, you owe $20,400. And you're like, it's not happening fast enough. And we wrongly then conclude in these types of scenarios that small decisions don't actually matter that much. We wrongly conclude that small decisions don't actually matter that much. But we have to understand that for the most part, our lives are the sum total of all the small decisions that we make. So we don't judge the success of a day by the harvest that we reap. Why? Because the harvest we're reaping today are from the seeds that we sowed yesterday. So we don't judge the success of today by the harvest that we're reaping. We judge the success of today by the seeds that we are sowing. Why? Because we know a result is coming, so we're sowing today, knowing that one day we will reap after we sow. So if you're wanting to lose weight, you judge today's success by the fact that you ate right today. You went to the gym today. You're wanting a thriving marriage. It's going to take time, but you're successful if you're sowing habits of love and respect and trust today. It's going to take a while for that fruit to grow into something that you would describe as a thriving marriage, but you got to stick with it, sowing those godly habits and those godly seeds into your marriage today so that you can reap later. If you're wanting a closer walk with the Lord, then take these habits we've talked about in this series and sow those seeds of righteousness today. And every day, and don't say, well, I did it yesterday, do it today too, every day. Why? Because small, consistent, God-honoring habits being sowed over time brings a God-honoring harvest of righteousness, relationships that honor God, a ministry that God can be proud of, financial strength and generosity, a God-honoring body. In all of these ways, when we look at it, we need to evaluate, am I sowing the seeds today to get me to the harvest that I want to see tomorrow? Okay, everything that I'm reaping today are from the seeds that I sowed yesterday or in the past. Everything that I will reap one day is based upon what I'm sowing today. And so I need to understand it's not just going to be an overnight success. It's small, consistent, God-honoring habits over time that reap a harvest of righteousness. Think about it this way. When you heat up water in a pot, do you just turn on the fire and boom, it's to the degrees that you want it to? No, it takes time to get it to the boiling point, right? When you heat up water, you apply the heat to it and it slowly becomes hotter and hotter. And the longer that flame, that element is under the pot, the water gets hotter and hotter to where you're at 100 degrees, then 120 degrees, then 170 degrees. And then eventually you're going to get to 211 degrees. What do you have at 211? Really hot water. And 1 degree more. What do you have? Boiling water. 1 degree. Slowly over time, 1 more degree, and boom, you have the result that you're looking for. So what happens when you faithfully implement godly habits in your life? The fire of God starts to burn within your soul, and one day you're on fire. You're reaping a harvest of righteousness. You're seeing fruit in your life. You have intimacy in your marriage. You have closeness with God. You have wisdom to navigate life circumstances. You have peace that doesn't even make sense, and it didn't just happen overnight. It's not an overnight success. It's faithfulness to small habits over time. The people that we see as spiritual giants, as mature Christians, as people who are anointed of God and spiritually powerful in the pulpit or in their lives and in their families and all of that, those people that we look at, we see all of that fruit. But you know what we don't often see? The fact that those people are engaging the scriptures on a consistent basis in their life. Their mind and their heart are saturated with the word of God. We don't see the constant praying over their self-doubt and the fasting to seek God and rely on Him and in full dependence, or all the ways that they serve people behind the scenes with their spiritual gifts and the constant heart evaluation that takes place to let God change their heart, and the confession to God of that sin, and the confession to those close to them to get healing, and taking time to rest in God and pause from the hustle and bustle of life so they can just stop and rest in Jesus. We don't see the consistency in all of these small ways. We just see the amazing fruit of their lives that God is bringing about, and we often then compare the small mundane habits of our lives to the amazing big fruit of other people's lives. And the truth is that fruit did not just happen in their lives. They aren't just joyful in the midst of a cancer diagnosis all of a sudden just because it just happened. There has been a small, consistent investment into their walk with God and their mind on the heart of God and the things of God that, as Paul says, bring about a peace and a joy that doesn't even make sense. It doesn't just happen. We often don't see all the little, small, consistent habits in someone's life that bring them to the point that make us go, wow, spiritual giant, mature Christian. And so then we get discouraged when that fruit isn't a part of our lives. And the truth is, don't compare your small, mundane habits to the big, huge fruit that you see in other people's lives. Because that didn't just happen in their life. It was a consistent, over time, planting seeds and God watering it. And then over time, reaping a harvest of righteousness. And so I'm here to encourage somebody today. Stick with it. Don't give up, and don't stop planting. Don't stop sowing. Don't stop evaluating your heart. Don't stop engaging the scriptures. Don't stop praying and fasting. Don't stop resting. Don't stop serving. Let us not become weary while doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up, if we do not lose heart. It's not easy, and it won't be overnight, but you will reap a harvest of righteousness for the glory of God if you don't give up, if you don't lose heart. That's a principle in God's word that you will reap after you sow. But the truth is, to get to that reaping, you have to sow. So you reap what you sow, you reap more than you sow, but you also reap after you sow. So don't give up. Don't lose heart. Stick with it. I was listening to a message on faithfulness not long ago by a man named Sam Roberts, and I want to share with you something I believe is helpful to the conversation for us this morning. He said, to not give up, to stay faithful, you will need grit. And he turned it into an acrostic, okay? We need grit if we're going to stay faithful, if we're going to keep moving forward. He says, first of all, you need grace. You need grace. First of all, you need the grace of God to work in your life. But he said you need to give yourself grace as well, because the truth is you're going to mess up. You're going to mess up. And what's true that Paul said, Jesus said to him that his strength is made perfect in weakness because his grace is sufficient for him. Let me ask you, if God says his grace is sufficient, then why would you ever live as if it is not? Give yourself grace. You're going to end up messing up, but give yourself grace and rely on the empowerment of God's grace. You'll need grit. You'll need grace. You'll need resilience, he says. You'll need resilience. In our passage, it says, do not grow weary in doing good, but to keep on going, not to give up. So stay resilient. And the illustration that he gave in that message was of, I think it was a parable of some kind that someone gave, but it was of a donkey that got stuck in a hole. And all of the farmers were looking down and they said, he's too heavy. He's the full-grown mule. We're not going to be able to do this. How are we going to get him out? I guess we just better bury him alive. And so they start shoveling snow onto him, and that a donkey, he would just shake off the dirt as it fell onto him, and it slowly just kept moving to the bottom of the hole. And every time that there was a little bit, he would just pick his feet up and be a little bit higher on dirt. And they just kept going. And they go, hey, it's actually helping. He's getting out of the hole. And so over time, he just stayed at it, and they kept shoveling dirt in, and he kept shaking it off, and it would fall to the ground, and he would be able to get a little bit higher until eventually he was out of the hole. But it didn't just happen. None of them were strong enough to get that thing out of the hole themselves. They were resilient. They continued to just go through, and that donkey itself was resilient. They're throwing dirt on me, but just kept shaking it off, is how he said it. The way he said it, he said he took theology from Taylor Swift. Shake it off is how he said it in that. But he said, you got to stay resilient. You got to stay resilient and keep moving forward. You will get there if you don't give up. The I, he says in grit, is for integrity. Integrity. He said, this will help you to be honest with yourself and with others about your growth. If you're going to not give up, if you're going to keep moving forward, you have to show integrity and realize, I'm not perfect. And when I fail, I need to recognize that. I need to recognize that I failed, and then just move past it, ask for forgiveness, and move forward. Show integrity. And then lastly, he says, you need teachability. He said in Proverbs 9:9, it says, give instruction to a wise man, he'll still be wiser. Teach a just man, and he will increase in learning. You can learn something from everyone. You can learn something from everyone. So if you're going to keep moving forward, if you're going to stay faithful, even in the small things, when it gets hard, what you're going to have to understand is you can learn from anyone. And the more you learn, the more you grow. And when you decide you know everything that you need to know, then you'll allow pride into your life, and then you'll fall. And that fall will make you think you're a complete failure, and it'll keep you from the grace and the resilience and the integrity that you need in this grit to move forward. He says, one lesson at a time, one day at a time, one faithful moment at a time. You just keep showing grit. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells a parable of some people who were given resources, and what they did in those small areas proved what they would do in big things. And Jesus said to those who were faithful, he said, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. So how are we doing in the small sowing of seeds today? Where do you want to be in a year? In 5 years, at the end of your life, where do you want to be? It's been said that when you're born, you look like your mom and dad, but when you die, you look like your habits, because you reap what you sow. You reap what you sow. So if you don't like what you're reaping, then change what you're sowing, because you reap what you sow, you reap more than you sow, and you reap after you sow. So trust God. Trust God that his promises and his principles are true. And over time, trust that if I won't give up, if I just keep sowing the seeds of righteousness now, the promise and the principle is true. I will reap a harvest if I don't give up.